Kate Mila, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. And it is time for our Saturday book. And this week we are returning to a good friend, somebody that everybody loves, Paul Wallis, the Eden Enigma. And it's the question of the ancient carvings in the mountains of Turkey carry memories of ET contact from the dawn of civilization. So this book is essentially the continuation of a conversation that Paul has continued with us from the very first book through to the next one. I can't keep up. And let me see if I can find a good description. Okay. Paul Wallis researches the world's ancestral narratives for their insight into human origins, human potential, and our place in the cosmos. His YouTube documentaries on the Fifth Kind TV, and the Paul Wallis channel are watched by millions worldwide. Paul is married with 3 children and lives in Australia. And as you probably know, has actually been a guest here on our channel when we finished his last book, his previous book, and is just the kindest and loveliest person and so interesting. He, for over 30 years, was an Anglican priest. He was not priest, archdeacon, one of those things. And he taught seminarians how to be a priest. He taught theology. He's also a linguist. He's very close friends with the former head of the Vatican linguist department, the Latinist for the Vatican. And he knows everybody involved in this kind of research. He's so knowledgeable, so well-traveled. And I am going to reach out and ask him to join us after we get closer to the end of this book. I'll try to entice him back to have a conversation about his latest finds. And a lot of what he describes in this book, you can find the process recorded on YouTube. So definitely seek him out, Fifth Kind TV. I think he does it through Gaia. I'm not 100% certain. So let's talk about this book, The Eden Enigma by Paul Wallis, published in 2025, because at least once a year he has to put a new book out. Chapter 1 is called Arrested. Dun, dun, dun. He is in Turkey. This is May of 2024. And I'm going to mispronounce everything. Let's just stipulate that from the beginning. And I apologize. That's a blanket apology to everybody and every place that I insult with my mispronunciations. I truly apologize. Kavustepe, Van Province, Turkey. So he's on day 1 of an expedition in Turkey with his friend Matt LaCroix, and they're doing the initial exploration, I guess you'd call it, for a documentary that Matt is making. And while they're there walking around, they're in a field, the police show up, and he's immediately nervous. Did we break a law? Do we not have the right permit? And he said he felt extremely vulnerable because he didn't speak the language. And, it's really hard to get your point across if you have no common language. And it's harder, I would guess. It's one thing to be an English speaker and not have Spanish in Mexico or not have Italian in Italy. There are root words. There is a common origin that's not all that far back, where if you dig around hard enough, you might come up with a synonym that gets your point across. He's in Turkey, and it's a little bit more demanding and complicated. So he's digging around in his pockets for his passport and his driver's license and his telephone. And he's getting nervous. He says his glasses fog up. So one of the things I love about his books is that it's a very you are there scenario. He's describing what he's going through in the moment. It almost has like a journal sense about it. And you never know from one chapter to the next what decade you're going to be in and what continent you're going to be on, because he does go back and forth, but they always tie together. So here we are in the middle of this field, nervous for Paul because his glasses are fogging up, and here come the police. So he's with Matt LaCroix, as I said, who's the executive producer of this documentary. And there's a cinematographer who's the guy who decides how the film is going to look, and then a whole crew, the audio guy, the camera guy, whoever. And they're scouting. That's the word. They're scouting for this documentary. And he's been speaking with Mehmet. And if you recall from the last book we did, this is the older man who's the guardian of this archaeological site. It's a ruin, and he has taken care of it for a very long time. And so Paul is busy talking to him, the curator and the guardian of the site. They're talking about actually what is there. And what they're talking about are 3,000-year-old cuneiform etchings on stones. And the place is called Urartu or Urartu. He says he can say two things in Turkish. He can say good morning and thank you. Well, if he could ask for a bathroom, he'd be all set. Really, that's all you need to know to get by and to break the ice with people. And after that, it's all downhill. People love it when you speak their language. But he realizes that these police are speaking Kurdish. And he says he's not feeling really optimistic when he comes face to face with these two police. He says it's a bit of a relief because he can tell that they're friendly with Mehmet, who's the guardian of this site. So he thought, well, let's try a little social media ploy, and he offers to take their picture, and that does it, and they ask, where is he from, and they're happy to hear that he's from Australia because that's something new to them. And they get their photo, they do a selfie, and they don't speak a common language, but they all eat lunch together and they try to communicate, and tensions go way down. The Urartu language, he says, is related to Mount Ararat. That word Ararat in the Old Testament. This is an area and a people and a civilization and a language. So we'll be using that term, and depending on the context, we'll be talking about any one of those things. It says this area is central to a variety of different world stories, which all have this particular spot as a common vector. The Sumerians, the Old Testament, the Greeks and Romans, the Romans said that this was where the Iron Age began. And how did they know that? And today, new archaeology actually confirms that. Here in the spot where he is the earliest evidence of building with stone by human beings and signs of the earliest of human agronomy. The Vikings mention this area in their stories of what they call Acer, the advance of the people who conquered Northern Europe and Scandinavia in the distant past. They came from there. And in these stories, the Acer came from what they called Asiland, which is ancient Armenia, and specifically the Van province where Paul is right now. So there's this weird, like he said, this vector this place in Turkey, what's really ancient Armenia, Mount Ararat neighborhood. They can see the mountain from where they are. The Vikings talk about coming from there, and the Romans talk about it being where the Iron Age began, and the Greeks talk about it, and the Sumerians way before them. He said it's the home of one of the world's oldest languages, and it's the home, to our knowledge, but it turns out not to be true, of the story of Noah's Ark. And it's actually where Noah's great-grandson came from, King Hike. So there is a king who lived in this place within reach of Mount Ararat, who was purported to be the great-grandson of Noah. That's interesting, because if you recall your Bible history, in the Old Testament, the ark landed on the top of Mount Ararat. It's also supposedly the home of Noah's descendant Abraham. I don't know what the link is between I can't say it. Hang on. Let me look it up again. Oh, come on. I want to say it correctly. Maybe I'm wasting time. I don't know. Urartu? This Urartu. This is really sad, because I've read this book and I've read that word about 50 million times, and for some reason it doesn't want to stick. But what does stick is how similar it is to, Abraham's home, Ur. Anyway, it's supposedly the home of Noah's descendant Abraham, and the Old Testament stories of Abraham are really the origin story of a reboot of humanity, that there was something before. So this is the land of Haldi, which we talked about in the last book, the god of the Urartians of the first millennium, BC, BCE, before Christ, before the Common Era, before 0 hour. These stories go back even farther than we think we go back. The farthest back we go in our origin stories. These stories are way older than that, to the powerful beings that were called Dingir. I'll spell it, Dingir, one word. So Paul has been drawn to this area, to this province, the Van province, because of the confluence of all these stories. And he's happy that his friend Matt is doing this documentary, and he's happy to help him scout out the area for it. Paul is hoping to find if there's an archaeological record that supports the claims of all these ancient stories. Can he bring them all together and tie them up with a neat little narrative bow? Is this where humanity began its recovery from an extinction event, the aftermath of what was called the Younger Dryas Cold period, the Ice Age, and then, the flood? So did our ancestors receive support from advanced or non-human beings, or did we do it on our own? What does the record say? What do the stories say? Because are these fairy tales? Or did these happen? Is this ancient history that has been around so long that it has become legend or lore? I will say, this is not in the book, but I'll say this, speaking of Abraham, how history becomes legend. Think about people that lived not that long ago. Not quite 200 years ago. 140, maybe. Look at Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the historical man. Abraham Lincoln, the legend. And just think about how time has already distorted. I just think that's fascinating. So Paul's going to share his archaeological finds that tell about our ancestors, when they were, who they were, what they were. And he says that this research so far has found images of a long lost language. And he wants to know how they survived. How did humanity, early humanity, grow in intelligence and develop skills, and then they flourished? How did that happen? And then they vanished, and then they came back again. So, like, what's going on? So this book focuses mostly on Turkey. He believes that in this area and in relationship to this story and this specific set of archaeological finds, they found coded messages. And you have to know what you're looking at to realize it's actually a code and not just cute etchings. He believes there's information here for all of humanity, and that it's actually repeated across global cultures if we know what to look for. This topic, paleocontact, is a stretch. He says it's often taboo. He certainly experienced that in his personal life. He says he has the advantage of linguistics, and he can trace much of what we're finding, we human, archaeology is finding, can be traced to common root word origins. And he mentions recent drone and orb activity. Now, I decided when I was doing this book that it's impossible for me to really summarize the story as much as I would like to. For one thing, I'm not allowed to. And for another thing, it's a very conversational book, and I don't want to be giving it verbatim. That's not okay. And sometimes the story almost requires that. So there are personal experiences that I'll make a brief reference to that you really need to get the book and read to get the absolute full details. So just describing drones and orb activity around them. And not only here in Turkey, but in other places. And this is all tied together. He says, is this Pentagon covert ops going on? Or are these intentionally, are they false flags to stir people up? Are they diversions from other things that are going on in the sky? Or are they a prelude from somewhere else, warming us up for something to come? We don't know. These are questions that he's putting out there to be thought about. And take a look at the video I just made with Deborah Lupien about that probe or that comet or that whatever it is behind the sun, EI Atlas. Kind of interesting. Not what I expected. But Paul is open to these questions, and more people are becoming open to them. Our ancestors saw the same kind of things going on in the sky all that long time ago. So his question is, did our ancestors manage to survive on their own, or did they have help? Okay, and this is not an agenda he hopes to fulfill. He's not arguing one side or the other. He's presenting what he sees and then drawing conclusions. So chapter 2, Windows on the Grass. And we are now in Meher Copy, Van City. He talks about the difficulty of climbing a cliff. Kind of feel sorry for him. I'd rather watch him do it, I'll tell you what. To reach Meher Copy, because he injured his knee 2 years earlier running into a door that opens to Meher Copy or Meher Kepi. This is actually called Haldi's Gateway or the Light Gate. And in local lore, Haldi you could call God, you could call a demigod, you could call like the Elohim, or you could call an ET. We simply don't know. But Haldi was this revered figure who in local lore was said to go back to the sky and who would return here again on a beam of light. The return of the gods is a common theme in global mythology. And he goes into some descriptions. We've talked about them so many times in his books before, so I'm just going to make a quick reference. The Mayans talk about it. The Jews in ancient Judaic belief talked about it. Minoans, the Norse, the Celts. It motivated early people to, like, they were waiting in anticipation, and they created rituals and they built constructions all geared towards that moment when that return would happen. Obviously, they were waiting for physical beings, or at least a physical return of some sort, who had been here before, helped out because they were looking forward in anticipation to their return, who left and who planned to return. Haldi, the name Haldi means taken or conquered. So there's some association there with military power. But he was revered as a great and skilled teacher in agronomy, civil engineering. He transformed a chaotic, poverty-stricken human environment into a paradise. That's acknowledged in their stories. And this is a global phenomenon of artifacts that tell a similar story. The names have been changed, to protect the innocent. The names have been changed and small details, but the common underlying thread of a story, the core narrative, is the same. Many global representations of these gates or to the stars exist, and we would call a gate to the star a portal. One of them is called the Naos, and it indicates it's what he called the Levant. The Levant was like, I guess, the Middle East, or just that general Mediterranean area. It indicated a region of space. It says Asherah, an advanced being who helped the Hebrews, came from the Pleiades. And this is this actual physical gateway portal. The doorway at Mahir Kapi, it's like a giant naos. It's yet another portal. And we're actually talking about a physical, like an opening. It's a structure, and in some cases, these things connected to buildings, and you went into a sanctuary. And in other cases, it was just this representation of an entryway, a separation between one space and another, the crossing of the threshold being a significant change in dimension or location or time. We don't know. Cuneiform that's written on it says that Haldi did not come alone. The Dinger came with 47 advanced beings or gods associated with various parts of nature and various skills. So it's kind of like they brought the pundits with them. They brought the experts in their field. And so they brought the person in charge of medicine, the person in charge of agriculture, the person in charge of astronomy, engineering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the word God is a choice. Did they consider them what we would define a god to be? We're not entirely sure what's going on here. This is all, I was going to say this is all up in the air. Sorry about that. But this is all great uncertainty. This is what we're trying to understand. So Paul recognizes the story of the Old Testament of the Elohim. It absolutely parallel. Yahweh is like Haldi's darker side. Yahweh kind of had a chip on his shoulder. He was always angry. The Elohim come from the sky. They manipulate the weather. They clear the atmosphere and clear away the flooded land. And the clearing of the air reveals the heavenly bodies. Familiar story, right? Judaism espoused contact with diverse beings before it was intentionally changed to monotheism. Judaism today is monotheistic religion, one of the great, meaning big, monotheistic religions like Islam and Christianity. Judaism was the earliest. It's from which these others come. And all people of the book being the Old Testament. And this monotheism was an intentional choice. Their original belief system was different, and we'll talk about that. The relationship between the Jews and the Elohim and the people of Van and the sky armies are very similar stories. There's lots of help and advancement involved, and a lot of the human beings honoring these beings and creating rituals and bringing them gifts and bringing them food. And same story is reflected in the story of the Anunnaki, and then the story of the feathered serpents of South America and Central America. Mesoamerica. Some narratives are about invaders who exploited humanity and the earth. And some are about positive intervention, that these beings came to help and to nurture. And Paul wonders what the Dinger were, what they did to evoke so much devotion from this megalithic peoples. Why was their return so desired? What were they hoping? What were the human beings left behind hoping would happen? He discusses being a guest in another person's country, and he says that different countries feel differently about guests. And he describes, he's a little tentative because he describes as a child being singled out. He lived in a very white area that was almost homogenous, and he was always asked where was he really from, because he had this head of hair that singled he wasn't a little blonde child. Today, England and Australia are far more diverse, and there's not quite as much novelty in looking different. But in Van, once again, he's different and he's noticed, and it brings back all those old uncomfortable feelings. It makes him very sensitive to being a stranger in a foreign land and guest. The city of Van is very modern. He said it really surprised him. It's very modern, but it has an older, slower vibe to it. And he said, despite the fact that they all look foreign, they're received with universal warmth and friendliness and kindness, and people couldn't be nicer to them. And he says he thinks that Abraham came from Turkey within the Fertile Crescent. And one of the reasons why he thinks that is because it's always referred to as the land of milk and honey. And while he's in Van, you know, they eat with the people. And he said they were literally offered milk to drink and honey with every meal. And this is not a common thing, the land of milk and honey. He thought, oh, that's interesting. This area has a rich farming heritage. So he goes to Cabo Stepe. That's where he almost got arrested. He says it's a megalithic complex with a temple, a sanctuary, a residential area, and more. It's located on the map in a very strategic place. It's on the road to Iran. It's in a place as far as like altitude and stuff. Tactical, kind of like with military thought in mind, but also economic on this trade route, an economic center. So he said as he was touring the area, he felt the shift in energy of this ancient sanctuary that was laid out like a traditional church, but much older. Much older, by 8 centuries older than a Christian church. And he does a lot of describing of the atmosphere, the energy inside what's essentially ruins. And I really related to what he was talking about. There is something so compelling. I know not everybody is a complete and absolute nerd. Sorry, Paul, but you are, so am I. There's something about old buildings. The older, the better. They have an energy, an atmosphere. And when I have gone into like a cathedral that's 1,000 years old, at first I was a little self-conscious because I thought, oh my God, am I so entirely brainwashed by my Catholic upbringing that I step inside a church and I immediately, feel that vibe? I don't think that's what it is, because I got the same feeling from ancient Roman ruins and ancient Greek ruins and ancient Byzantine things. There is something. Oh, I'm thinking of in California, what's left of the Chumash. They're not traditional settlements. They're when they were already imprisoned by the Spanish into slave labor to build the missions. But there's a feeling and an environment, an atmosphere about them. And I think that's why people are drawn to places like Machu Picchu, and because you can feel art. Of course, Egypt, Giza, of course, you can feel the energy there. And does the presence of this ancient archaeology create the energy, or is the ancient archaeology, was it originally built because the energy was there? There's a good question. So he talks about how he feels the shift of energy in the sanctuary, and how these ancient temple complexes are laid out exactly like Christian churches. But which came first? We know which came first. The ancient sanctuaries, the ancient temples came first. So who's copying whom? He describes an inscribed dedication by the builder to the complex that is half a mile long. This inscription just goes on and on and on. He talks about the priority that was given in the engineering of these places. There was a purpose, and it wasn't just a ritual religious purpose. He said priority was given to food storage, that they knew about having surpluses and storage of food. So this is a big development, an evolutionary step for people. And he said, obviously, they were trying to sustain a substantial population. And so it became apparent by its location, its structure, and its purpose that it was involved in military security, food security, and honoring the visitors from the sky, Haldi and the Dingir. So excavation began there in 1961. It went on until 1986, at which point it stopped. And I'm not sure why it stopped. He didn't say. I could have looked it up and I forgot to. I will put this down and I will try to figure out why. I tend to think it was probably geopolitics. But it picked up again in 2016. And it's obvious, he said, that the very ancient, at some later time, was rebuilt. So what he's saying is the remnants of what we see are a more modern iteration of something that was even older, much older. And so the question is why and by whom were these things built? How much older was the something that was obviously there before? He says it seems probable that there were earlier people there. Because why not? Because it was so fertile and so beautiful. Also, the area is also called Hey Kaberd. King Hike, remember Noah's great grandson, is the progenitor of this ancient Armenian people that they know lived there. And their whole culture and the whole idea of King Hike, it's all strongly associated with this whole mythology, this whole story of Haldi. Hike was a giant, so it adds another little interesting feature here. Noah's great grandson was literally a giant, and he's associated with weapons that were remarkable enough to talk about. And he's associated with these original conquerors. I couldn't think of the word. I knew it was, I wanted to say conquistadore. I knew that was wrong. So there's this common thread from these original beings, Haldi, the 47, the Elohim types, the Dingers, and through Noah's descendants, Abraham, and all the way, and to the Armenians, and this common story that can be heard even in far-flung places like other continents. So we're talking about a post-apocalyptic repopulation. And Paul says that this is Genesis, but it's also Sumerian cuneiform tablets. It's also from Babylonia. It's also from the Akkadians. And they're all kind of in the same area, right? Mesopotamia, the land between the river, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And these Mesopotamian stories, the argument he's making is that Mesopotamian stories came first, and the Bible built on them. And then the Armenians and the Jews ended up with their separate cultures, but going back to those same origins, mutual origin. He says even the math tracks, when you look at these stories and you get into the details of them, the survival craft, some would call it an ark, they all talk about the same size of a boat within fractions. In the British Museum, there's a 3,000-year-old world map. It identifies Urartu, Ararat, as the place of the ark. And the people of ancient Armenia claim and take pride in these origins. They don't regard this as a fairy tale. They regard this as their ancient history. So he describes some direct linguistic links that I'm not going to get into because it's a lot, and you should get the book and read the book. But he and Matt inspect a carved basalt block, and this is kind of where we left them in the last book. And it's etched on it with Haldi's gateway, and it's sort of a triple inset doorway. It depicts a portal across more than one dimension. And it's like these windows that they found buried. There's 7 in all. They're buried in the hillside. And there's this repetition of the theme of portals is what he's getting at. He describes one huge one with much symbology that's called Haldi's basalt block. And this was found in the 1960s. It was one of 4 that were supporting a giant altar that created a sanctuary, and depictions of window portals are all over it. So there's something significant about these doorways. And he says, And P.S. These blocks, which are absolutely enormous, were lifted 60 feet in the air. And, you know, it kind of begs the question, how? They haven't been able to figure it out. So chapter 3, Dinger, and doorways. So this is now 2024 still, and they're at the Van Museum. He regards this doorway, these doorways and archways, as sort of a representation of going into another space. And it's kind of like an invitation. And he says it looks like thousands of years older than maybe we conventionally thought. There seems to be reason to believe from recent archaeological finds in Turkey that it's time to redo our chronology. The arch is, in architecture, it's a convention. And it's more than just like an engineered construction. He says it's an invitation. It's a feature in entrances to churches and temples. It's a psychological thing. It ushers us into a liminal space. We don't even think about it. We don't think twice about it. But if you look at especially older, you know, ancient constructions and medieval, older, a lot of archways draw you in, you know, and the aisle is this tempting path forward, and it all focuses down onto the altar. Psychological. There's a reason for this. So he describes the 3 adjacent arches that are etched into this basalt block, and he says there's no instructions. He says it's left up to us to decipher what space we're being invited into. And are there 3 because it's an invitation to another dimension? Is this what it is symbolically telling us? Is it trying to evoke a different mindset completely? It's a great question. I mean, there's no answer manual. We have to figure this out. So it's signaled that entering should be with a higher mindedness. There's that implication that in the time before, in which it was created and before it was created, there was a higher mindedness, and we have to enter back into that. The sanctuaries of holy places were only entered by priests, and they were priests under the influence of psychoactive oils. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but he often brings us back to the acknowledgement that in Christian rituals today, there's the inclusion of the chalice and the wine. There's this sense of a psychoactive drink that brings us into union with God or the gods. He said there's a protocol for communication with Elohim or the highest beings, whatever the terminology you use. And there's reason to ask, as we shall see, about similar rituals in Ararat, Urartu, and in Christianity, and in a whole lot of different belief systems. These people in the past hoped for a connection with the ancient gods. These ancient people wanted to reconnect with something even more ancient. And in this place, in Turkey, it's the Dinger. And they have gateways all over the province. There's just these archway constructions everywhere. And Wallis explains that they use the word gods differently than we did. I kind of made reference to that earlier. He does a better job of explaining it than I did. He said Plato used the word God in this way. This is what he meant. So this is Plato. He says there's a curious overlap between the word gods and people. And he called them, when he used these words, he was talking about those who lived on islands in the air or islands in the sky. People who are more intelligent than we are, they live longer. who, because they learn to travel faster than we, are able to get themselves beyond our atmosphere into outer space, and who therefore enjoy a more developed understanding of the cosmos than we do. He says it's no stretch to call them extraterrestrials because they're beyond the planet Earth. And it's curious, their attributes overlap with what Plato and the Greeks understood concerning the ancient gods. Plato, his peers, and those who followed his writings believed that these advanced beings interacted with our ancestors, parenting new cultures and progressing human intelligence. So a little bit of Plato here, these islands in the sky, to remind us that we're talking about something not amorphous. We're not only talking about a non-physical situation when we talk about the gods, because as the ancients, like Plato, told us, they're real, they're substantial, they're physical. The Eretrians spoke the same way about the Dingers. Also, the Anuna of Sumeria, the Anunnaki of Babylonia. In Babylonian script, it was written as a glyph, and it was written as the sky. So very clearly associated the notion of these beings, gods, and outer space. The sky people is what it translated as, or the star people, or space people, depending on what you were reading. So these cultures all talked about a golden time in the past when these gods came down and lived among us, and our ancestors longed for their return. So he takes himself to this new museum, the Van Museum. He says it's beautiful. He's struck by how familiar many of the artifacts look. So he talks a lot about these helmets that are in a movie, The Planet of the Apes, with, I think, Mark Wahlberg. So I think it must be a remake. And how the helmets in the museum of these ancient people are identical to the helmets worn by the apes, military guys, in the movie. And later on, he talks about discovering that there probably was a direct borrowing of that imagery. And I actually found pictures of them, and I'll put them in my community post for you. I hope I remember to do it after I'm done here. And you can look it up and look at the pictures and see what they look like. So he's wandering around this museum, and he says it's just full of very familiar to him, because he studied it, Mesopotamian motifs, Gilgamesh, Assyrian sculptures, winged genies with buckets and pine cones. You see a lot. You see a profile view of a standing guy with a beard, and he's holding what looks like a purse in one hand and a pine cone in the other. And we're going to talk more about that. He says, this is a symbolic language. This is when you saw these things as a person of that time, it meant something to you more than just, oh, it's a pine cone and a purse. It symbolized something greater, concepts. And it goes back to a mother culture in Sumeria, because they had the same symbolism. So he wants to decode the messages in the art. He says they're telling us something. He draws a similarity between the basalt structures and medieval buildings in England. In Urartian artifacts, the bottom basalt bases are older and more solid and more formidable and more sophisticated. And then the next layer, he says you can go to medieval England, and you can see structures there where the lower stories are brick and stone, but the upper are less substantial. They're wattle and daub, which is woven branches and mud and straw stuck in them and then painted over. And there's similar stuff that goes on in the early colonies of North America, The bottom are stone and the upper are clapboard. And in the ancient ruins, it's an extreme difference between the bottom, the engineering of the bottoms, and the extreme impermanence, he says, of the tops. Why would they do that? Why would they build on something more sophisticated with something less sophisticated? It begs the question, was there a more sophisticated culture that built the originals and a later people who tried but could not replicate the techniques? Did a later culture exploit the remains of a much earlier, far more advanced culture? What if the Urartians, I'm so sorry, I can't say it, Urartians, weren't the original culture that was here? And that's the implication. They travel then, while they're there, Paul Wallis and his pals, to a higher place, Ionis. And he's talking about the climb up. You have to go up a wooden structure that's more than a mile above sea level. Sounds like fun. And he said it has beautiful views. It's a special place. And then he talks about something really interesting, which I think I knew but hadn't realized, if that makes any kind of sense. I recognized it without articulating it in my brain, that these places are built not only for their observational ability, their panoramic views of what's going on, which has a military implication, but they're also chosen in sites where the rocks have magnetic properties that measurably affect people's chemistry. And he's learned from his studies that there's a physical, psychological effect in an elevated rocky area if it has flowing water and overlooks views of the water. There is something electromagnetic that happens, and it's actually measurable. And this knowledge is replicated in the traditions of many, many religions. For example, he talks about Benedict of Narcia, and he spent a long time trying to develop a neo-monastic network based on the rule of Benedict. And this happened after the chaos of the time when the Romans left Western Europe and headed for the Byzantine world, Constantinople. The Benedictines kept up what was left to keep up of a more sophisticated culture that was slowly disintegrating to time. So they kept up astronomy, agronomy, civil engineering, food science, medicine, all things that mark human progress. And their rule let diverse groups live and cooperate together. And their choice of sites was really significant. They lived austere lives, but they chose locations carefully. Always high on mountains, in nature, near magnetic rock, surrounded by streams, with an elevated view of the water. And it was a life that was very suited to enlightenment. It was simplified and brought down to the basics. He said you could feel it. You could feel it when you went to these sites, and you could feel it at this place called Ionis. He noticed the precision and the weight and the joins of the basalt rock, and it reminded him of Pumapunku in Peru, which was pre-Incan. And obviously, because of the situation, these gigantic blocks were lifted 6 to 8 feet in the air to be placed. And he said this was impressive engineering, and nobody knows how they did it, which kind of brings to mind the construction of the pyramids, which continues to be a matter of debate. By contrast, he said the mud bricks of the upper layers were melted and disintegrated, and actually made what looked like mud flows down the sides of the basalt because they just melted in the weather. A striking difference in engineering. Why would you do that? He said the floor plan scheme is the same as at Cavas Tepe, where they met the Copts, and very much like early Christian churches, which came thousands of years later. So the way the church is set in relationship to the east and the west, the points of the compass, and the placement of the sanctuary, they're all based on directions that are best energetically for prayer. I'm not sure that I knew that. But this has been described by what they call the earliest church fathers. We're talking 100 after the death of Christ, or the birth of Christ, 200 after the death of Christ. Very, very early on, before the Nicene Council. Tertullian, Basil of Caesarea, Clement of Alexandria. He said this building convention is far older than Christianity. They copied it from the earlier pagan systems. And he says it contains forgotten meanings. I mean, why does it really matter what direction the sanctuary faces? Why would that matter? So he describes how it was all replicated at St. Paul's Cathedral in England. And he describes the ritual procession that he took part in when he became a priest. He says the ritual procession copied the Roman imperial processions. I didn't know that. I think that's so interesting. A visitor from ancient Rome would recognize the hierarchical placement of participants in the procession, the significance of the symbols and the colors in the dress and in the ritual. The jeweled skull cap, the fish head dress of the senior clergy, this reflected ancient Babylonian lore. That their earliest ancestors were beings from the sky that were partially fish-like who came to give knowledge. And the hat was actually a totem of these progenitors' wisdom. The bishops wore purple, which was the color of the Roman emperor, and we know it's from the Phoenicians, the shellfish that they gathered the dye from. It was rare and difficult to get and very expensive, and only the highest nobility had it. It became the imperial color of the Roman Empire. And it's used to this day as the color of royalty, which, of course, I have to add, explains why it's my favorite color. Chosen by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE as the exclusive royal color. Nobody else was allowed to wear it. Purple robes have meaning in Christian, and then Jewish, and then Roman, and then Persian, and then Babylonian. I'm going backwards here. When he became a priest, he didn't realize all this symbolism was involved, and it was far older than Christianity. He didn't know that. He had to learn that. It's not something that was taught. And he does give some examples. The chasubles, the candles, the sacrament, the silver and gold chalices, the eagle adorning the lectern, the east-facing building, the circular font near the entrance representing death and rebirth, the narrowed and raised and sometimes walled sanctuary at the east end, the art on the walls, halos, serpents, dragons, winged messengers, all about contact from another realm. And they're all symbols which long predate the narratives of Christianity. Of course, this rich lexicon of symbols belongs to the Catholic and Orthodox end of the spectrum of the Church of England. So evangelical and Pentecostal churches don't really do that. And they pared their visual aesthetics down to a bare minimum, the symbol of the cross. But we're going to get to that too. And that's borrowed from an older lexicon, which is absolutely fascinating. We will get to that. But I mentioned that I had not realized, I had felt but not realized that there was this electromagnetic energy associated with water. Didn't even occur to me until I read this. So I've talked before about being at the Church of St. Clement, the English name, in Rome. And it's a beautiful, I want to say cathedral. That might not be the right word, but it's a beautiful, huge, gigantic church. And it's built on the site of a much earlier Christian church. It's a Catholic cathedral. And it's built on the side of a, like very early Middle Ages, very early medieval. So like the year 400 or something close to that. And there are some very faint frescoes on the wall, and you can see these guys with their bowl cuts and their tunics, and you know, very very old. It's just fascinating. But what really impressed me is if you go down a few more stairs, you get to a lower level, and there's an old stone altar to Mithras. And Mithras was a pagan god brought from Persia, Zoroastrians, that was adopted by the Roman army as like the mascot of the Roman army. It was their god. And the significant part that I didn't put two and two together was when you were in there in the bottom of the church on the underground, you could hear water flowing. And we were told that there was water running under the city of Rome, and some of it was sewer conduits, and some of it was the old aqueducts, and some of it was just naturally occurring water that had been piped, you know, for the sake of integrity of buildings. But these are natural springs running under the town, under the city. And that's where they chose to build their altar to Mithras, was right by this really rushing current of water. You could hear it. It was really dramatic. And it wasn't until I read this book that I put two and two together. So let's see here. In Ionis, this is that high place that they went to that was a mile up. Under the narthex is a running water course, and it's explained as a drain for animal sacrifice blood. And, you know, they did animal sacrifice to Mithras as well. The symbol was the bull. The animal sacrifice was, okay, so, I wrote this down, the Church of St. Clement and Mithras. I wanted to remember to tell you guys about that because I just find that absolutely fascinating. Let's see here. How are we doing as far as... Okay, I'm going to stop here because we've already gone over an hour, and I'll continue in the next chapter. So this is the end of video number 1. And I'll be back with video number 2. And I hope that you're enjoying this. I find this particularly fascinating. And there's some more really interesting archaeology coming up. So stick around, stay tuned. Thank you very much for watching. Slán go fóill. Slánte.